Good morning, everyone. I'm Joyce Anderson, co-founder of Honest Game, and welcome to our Navigating the Highs and Lows of Being a Student Athlete, a mental health digital side chat. We are so excited to have you all joining us. I was a college athlete, Division I college athlete myself. I coached high school tennis for over 10 years and have advised thousands of student athletes, families, high school coaches, and counselors on academic eligibility and academic and recruiting for college sports. Real quick, Honest Game is a public benefit corp, and our mission is to bring equal access to college athletics. We pair a student's passion for sports with their motivation for learning in the classroom with academic eligibility tracking software, counseling and training modules, and we also support a student athlete's mental health in the academic eligibility and recruiting process. We're super excited to introduce our two speakers today. In this fireside chat, Dr. Jocelyn Carter is a professor of clinical psychology at DePaul University and studies stress and coping in children and adolescents. She is currently researching the impact of sports involvement on mental health, drawing from her own experience as a collegiate sprinter and youth soccer coach. Dr. Carter consults with college athletic departments and youth sports clubs to help athletes and coaching staff maximize health and performance. And Stephanie Bernthal is a former Division I head coach, professional counselor, and founder of Beyond Sport Coaching. She offers mental health education designed to equip institutions and coaches with tools specific to their role in the lives of student athletes. And in addition to her extensive counseling and coaching experience, she has vast knowledge of the college admissions process, having served as an enrollment counselor. We're excited to have you all here, and this fireside chat will be recorded. And we will share the link afterwards. And rest assured, we will reserve time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. So Stephanie and Jocelyn, let's jump in. We're going to popcorn some questions with these two experienced speakers. And the first question is, how can sports impact a young person's mental development? Jocelyn, why don't you take it?
Or I'll start with that. Sports can impact a young person's mental, emotional, and social health in a lot of different ways. The big three that I sort of think about are the development of skills and competence. So one of the things that we know about child and adolescent development, and really the development of all people, is that we feel better about ourselves when we feel like we are contributing and learning and growing. And sports are a great opportunity to go from being a novice or a beginner in something to an expert. So children who participate get experience with that. The other big strength with developing as a young athlete is the supportive community. So physical activity in general is really good for our mental and physical health, but physical activity in the context of sports provides children with access to supportive networks in terms of their peers or their teammates, but also with respect to the ability to develop a relationship with a coach. And I've started thinking about coaches as being more like mentors in the lives of young people. And so that is a really great benefit of sports. The third that is really relevant to our discussion today is just exposure to new kinds of opportunities. So be that with opportunities to travel, opportunities to be in different settings and situations that most young people may not have the opportunity to do without sport, and also the opportunity to interact with people who are different from them. So, lots of opportunity to learn from people maybe who grow up in a different neighborhood or have a different background, and you get to do life with them as an athlete. So that's all beneficial.
Awesome. And Stephanie, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's all such awesome stuff. I think the ability to be present, when you're competing, when you're learning, when you're practicing something, a little different than like cerebral knowledge. You're using your body, you're going out there and you're working in an environment where you're getting constant feedback from people, from your body, and from the environment. So those are all really important keys to life, beyond sport. In that we're all operating in realms where we need to be in touch with those parts of ourselves And I love that Jocelyn mentioned that community piece, because I think, we're talking about the pathway to potentially go and play at higher levels. And so those communities change and those environments change as we move on that, journey. But there's so much exposure that we can take from those different parts. Different sports we play, we learn different things kinesthetically and then conceptually, about pressure, even what that looks like more individually or as a team. And so all of those are really opportunities to try, and we will fail as athletes too, and to learn about that process. And that is, I think, one of the hardest processes in life. We never grow out of trying and failing things, even when we're experts at stuff. But it's a great muscle that is constantly stretched when you're an athlete. And so we think all great athletes, they just never fail. They're just so great at everything, but it's really, they've mastered that process of feedback and how to cope with it. So I love that part of sport.
I love that. Both of your contributions kind of give me goosebumps, because I'm like brought back to when I was a young athlete, or my own kids, or the kids I coached, and how there are so many pieces of youth sports that can affect how you grow as a young person in your mental health. And we don't really think about it because it just happens, right? So much of it is organic in that whole process. So how does participation in sports continue to positively affect a person as they move on through high school and beyond? Stephanie, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, it's a really interesting place we're in, where youth sports, I've been on the far end in the college realm, and I think we have to be careful that we stay on a journey. I think a lot of times, there's financial investment, there's time investment, there's pressure, with all the decisions of how to best use our time on that path, and how far can we go with it, and all of those things. So I think it's great to dream and to go after that, but being present in where we are at and the stage we're on and the people we're around, and the small wins, today, not just trying to get that scholarship down the road. That's such a mantra for me, because I was in that realm for so long of people at that point. And it broke my heart as a coach when I'd sit in a recruiting conversation and someone would be breaking down, because they were just at such a point of exhaustion on the journey. And that tells me, there's so much to unpack there for each individual, but there's been a pressure to build to something, which isn't necessarily bad to have those goals, but how do we navigate it as we keep going along the process? And I think we just are in a space where we really have to be smart and reevaluate that as people around sport, all of us, clubs, high schools, administrators, mental health professionals around this. There's just a different level of pressure on that. So I think there's a lot of learning, but there's also moments to just stop and breathe, and enjoy, get back to what we enjoy about doing this. Because sport is going to end at some point for everybody. And hopefully we have the deposits of it in our life, not just having rushed to get to some point. It's easier said than done, obviously.
Totally. And Jocelyn, what would be some things that a young student athlete, who's progressing through college, would be able to take with them when they leave high school on their post-secondary journey? How does that weave into their development as a young adult?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially given what Stephanie just shared about how participating in sports at the collegiate level is not necessarily the path for everyone, but regardless of whether they continue into college and beyond, there's lots of transferable skills. Stephanie referred to those. I think probably, most of us think about like discipline, routines, and structure as sort of the most obvious ones. athletes are really, really good at goal setting and tracking outcomes, which is really helpful for navigating life as a college student or in whatever career someone has. Stephanie also talked about that ability to respond to challenge. So this is something that I've seen in personal observations, but then also with the research in terms of people's response to challenge now. So we're living in a time where all of us, young people included, have been exposed to lots and lots of stressors and lots of traumas. And athletes are used to, in most cases, seeing a challenge, seeing something that maybe seems unattainable, and rather than giving up and quitting, moving forward in some way and learning how to be flexible and how to adapt. So those are all great skills that I think we see in the research literature on the long-term effects of sports participation, is that adults who participate in sports have lower levels of depression, they have better health habits, they've made physical activity and sleep and nutrition an important part of their lifestyle. So continue to reap benefits like psychologically, emotionally, cognitively, and then physiologically into adulthood.
Yeah, and I think about like applying to college or graduate school or applying for a job. There's always a reason why an employer or an admissions officer will see your participation and your leadership and your score as a benefit, that you have the ability to push yourself beyond other, mental, barriers and physical barriers because you've applied yourself in a specific kind of way in your sport. So when we're thinking about who's listening today, I know a lot of our listeners are adults in a student's village. And they're wondering how they can help their student athletes cope with the stresses on and off the playing field. And obviously, different adults can serve different roles in encouraging that positive mental health. So Stephanie, when you're thinking like from a coach's mentality, how can a coach really support their student athletes in a positive way?
Yeah. They say coaches touch thousands of lives, right? So, number one, I would just love to say, because we're in a time where it's just really hard. It's been hard on everybody, post-COVID, there's been so much pivoting, adjusting. And I know even in the college space, there's been a feeling for coaches of like, I can never do enough, here. And so I want to acknowledge that for administrators, for teachers, for coaches, for mental health professionals. I mean, the need feels so large. And stepping into that in and of itself is huge. We need people to continue standing in the gap there. So we're never going to be perfect on that. However, there's just presence, I say, over the perfection of, having the exact right thing to say, or we can't open every door for these athletes. We can help equip them to walk through things. And I think that's part of the thing that I really tried to focus on as a college coach. My goal obviously was to win championships. And part of my pivoting out of that is like, I want to see people young women walk into life equipped and walk through those doors ready, a little bit more than I care about winning, an NCAA championship at this point. Okay, that's probably my point to move on. But the point being, we can hold all those things, in balance of, we want to see people achieve, obviously, and take the next step. What does it look like for that individual? How are our listening skills for them? Sometimes an athlete just needs to be heard, listened to. There's so much output happening. And oftentimes these folks are so internal. There's so much going on under the surface. It's a very unique population that sometimes the moment is just being that space to be safe and to listen and to provide modeling at points that's positive. Again, we're not perfect. Sometimes it's accountability. Like as a coach, I've shown ownership. I'm like, hey, if I'm frustrated as a college coach about accountability and ownership, then I need to actually model points where I miss the mark, and I am taking that step to say it, because that may not be something this person's seen in their life. So I think there's a lot there, but it's helping people take the step on their journey while also just keeping in mind the pressures in the space to, be present with what they're walking through in the day to day.
Yeah, I think I really, that resonates with me, the concept of ownership, because, coaches and the adults in the students village have so much power. And the kids really look up to them, right? And the kids in a lot of ways see these adults as perfect beings. And when the coach or the adult in the village can kind of show their vulnerability and, hey, I'm flawed. You don't have to be perfect because I'm not, right? And I don't expect you to be. I think it can be super powerful for kids to realize, like, oh, I don't have to be perfect all the time in everything I do. And that can be a really big weight off their shoulders, right? Jocelyn, what do you think about parent guardians or other adults in the student village and how they can support?
Yeah, so I think from a psychologist's perspective, all of these relationships are so important, but I think that the relationship that a parent or caregiver has with their child is so special. And I think that one of the things that happens that can happen, especially if a child has a lot of athletic talent that's been identified early, that's been nurtured and invested in so many ways by parents. I think that our young people get the idea that their parents' love and approval of them is dependent on their athletic performance. And so the athlete can be really motivated by that desire not to disappoint or not to waste time that's been poured into them. And so I think for parents, it's really important for them to, first of all, not have that mindset. So I think especially for parents, I'm one of them as well, who know about the value of sports and want athletic accomplishment for our kids, but separating out our own desires from our children's desires and really making sure that they're taking the lead on things, because they are so smart in terms of interpreting even subtle messages that we think that they're not picking up on. So I think we really do have to, as much as possible, take a step back and remember that, we're not their coaches, we're not their trainers, we're not in these other roles. Primarily we're their parent, and we're that safe spot to land when maybe everything else is sort of blowing up for them in the athletic performance. But that takes self-awareness and control and restraint on the part of the parents too. I think the other thing, one other key thing that parents can do to help their children navigate things is really help them figure out what kinds of stressors or challenges the kids are experiencing, and help the child or adolescent match their response to the stressor. So a lot of times, parents can sort of get sucked into, playing time issues, or there's favoritism on the team, or whatever this thing is that's going wrong. And so obviously we want parents to listen to their kids, but not get so sucked up and caught up in that they're not able to help the child maybe see a different perspective, or help them think about, giving their, coach the benefit of the doubt, and sort of just help them sort of problem solve, and then see what the child thinks is the best thing to do, rather than going directly to the, to the coach themselves, or talking to so-and-so's parents, and really let the child practice the ownership and accountability that we were talking about. So listen, but don't I would say to all of the drama. And remember, it is the child's experience they're having, it's not yours. And we don't have to, as parents, micromanage all of that, even though it's really tempting to try to control that with our kids. It's tempting to try to control everything with our kids, but research And practical experience says it doesn't work. So we'll try to let go.
Yeah, I definitely think that like sports is a kid's student athlete's safe space to fail and make mistakes and be disappointed. And it's an amazing opportunity for them to learn how to lose with grace or how to be disappointed or how you can work so hard for something and still not get what you want, right? And um, it's hard for parents to see that, right? It's hard. It breaks your heart to watch your child work so hard and not get what you know they deserve. But at the same time, it's like an amazing life lesson, right? For all levels, for all um, student athletes who make it and who don't to the next level, right? You're both so incredibly experienced working with student athletes, so you've seen the highs and lows. Stephanie, what are some red flags that you look out for when you're working with student athletes to ensure you're, approaching them when you need to and getting to them before things get, out of control?
Yeah. This is, I think, so key, especially at the college level. I like to remind folks at that level, this is the most support a student might have in their whole life. You have everything at your fingertips. In high school, you have a lot of support too, but you're also in that place where family's your primary, support more than likely, in your community and things like that. This is really like the launching period in college where you've got this village around that is after that, you're on your own. So it's a really interesting place where I try to encourage, if I'm seeing or if I was seeing something as a college coach, like, withdrawal, some key kind of clinical things like sleep issues, difficulty, going to class, managing a schedule. So these are things, they might be daily living things that maybe the young adult didn't learn as well independently at home, but you know what? It might be clinical. It might be they're experiencing some depression or anxiety. They're having social anxiety getting out of their room and getting to class. I mean, in the post-COVID point, I've seen a marked difference in some of these basic living sort of things. And it makes a lot of sense based off of how we were living life for a long time and some developmental muscles not being built to get to the, a different environment like college. But yeah, how are we managing our eating? How are we, if I'm frustrated because someone in a film session is tuning out all the time, never paying attention, maybe there's some ADHD there that, no one's ever really been able to put their finger on that before. There's lots of things that show up in ways that as a coach, they kind of strike a nerve. And you have to step back. I talk to departments a lot about this. We got to put the pieces together and see, is there a larger story here that is not a poor coping skill? It's some biology, and it maybe is something we can help with clinical support. And it's amazing how much that can change someone's journey when we put those pieces together and we get the right support around a young adult at that point, and it changes their life. So sometimes I think about it as, what is really frustrating as far as behavior output. And let's walk that back and see, is there something more going on here that's contributing beyond like a bad attitude? Okay, that's a really broad brushstroke to paint with. And oftentimes there's a lot more to the story there. Teammate issues, coach player issues. Some of that comes down to a lot more, depression can show up in a lot of different ways in an athlete that are pretty detrimental to a team environment. And we have to understand it may not be a resistant person. They may have never coped with some of these things coming up, which Jocelyn can speak to. Mental health, clinical issues start arising in this age group. And some people just don't have the tools to understand and recognize what that looks like. And as a population, we're less likely to go seek that immediate support. So the coach might be the gatekeeper to say, hey, would you think about maybe pursuing some more support, or bringing this, I love to be a supporter here, but I am not equipped in these realms to maybe help you take the next step. I think of academic counselors and advisors who do that a lot too. They get that because they're a little bit of a safer space. And honestly, athletic trainers get it a lot, because they're really in the camp of the athlete, and they are a true, they're just there providing care. So it's interesting because we have all these lay people who, if we can sort of get to the bigger issue, like Jocelyn said, as a parent, yeah, there might be playing time issues or all these things. There may be larger themes that we can say, hey, I love, hearing and supporting you, but have you thought about maybe reaching out and utilizing some of these other services? There's a risk to that because you'll have some athletes who buck that. And they're like, you're trying to say I have a problem. I think there's a way we use language to talk about, hey, is there more? Is there more maybe? We all want more as athletes. We want higher performance. Hey, is there maybe a way this could be easier? Or is there a new way to go about this?
Yeah, I used to think when I was a high school coach, I spent more time with the girls in season than they did with anyone else, right? And so I had the opportunity to they open up because they're not in class anymore. They let their guard down, and they show more when they're on the court, or because that's their outlet, right, or the field. So the coaches have the ability and the time to see it, but it's hard because you've got so many tasks as you're in your own job. To identify these additional red flags can be difficult. So Jocelyn, perhaps you have a few more red flags that high school coaches or ADs or counselors might see. And if they hear it from you all today, it may there might be a light bulb one day down the road when they're working with their kids and wondering why is so-and-so acting this way,
Yeah. So I'm glad, that we're talking about this, because I think one of the things that's easy to forget is that, yes, we know there's a lot of challenges to being a student athlete and lots of great rewards too, but just because someone is an athlete doesn't mean that all of the normal stressors and difficulties are going away for them as well. So they may be layered on top of all of these other things that we're talking about. One of the things that I've been reading and thinking and hearing more about now is just lack of motivation. People are talking about it with employment and the Great Resignation, but also just burnout, because by the time a lot of youth get to high school, they've had hours and hours of usually a single sport, right? And so there's lots written about specialization in one sport or another. And I think especially during the high school phase, if athletes are looking ahead to what a college path looks like to them, another sort of place to pay attention to in terms of a red flag is when a high school student or potential recruit ends up selecting a sport for college that, if you had to guess as an athletic director or coach, that this was actually not their primary sport, but maybe they got the messaging that a scholarship will be easier to obtain in that sport, or they'll be more competitive in one realm or another. So that's another area to just look out for, and maybe ask some more questions about what messages they got, or why they made that decision, because usually people are committing to a single sport in college. So that's a place to pay attention to. It may be an individual sport, but you see that they're really motivated actually by the social component and those teammates. And so digging in a little bit more there can be really helpful. And Stephanie already mentioned some of the risks that coaches and others may face when bringing up the idea of additional support to their athletes. But in an environment where everyone's sort of always comparing each other against particular benchmarks or standards, I think that setting a culture where having a mental health issue that needs to be addressed clinically is encouraged, and not something that makes especially young people think like, oh, that means I'm gonna lose the starting spot, or other people will think that I'm weak, or this is just like what they're waiting for because they don't really like me on the team. So when we say as adults to someone, we think that you would need more, or you would benefit from more, they're thinking about all of these other reasons or motivations why you might be saying that. So we have to really actually create the climate that says this is okay, and then make sure to communicate to that to them too, or other people. It would be confidential or whatever those kinds of concerns are that they may have, that they're not voicing to you unless you sort of initiate the conversation.
I hear a lot of alignment there with academic strategies as well, right? Like if you have learning challenges, own them, be proud of them, and get the supports you need, right? Or even academic eligibility. Like don't try to hide it, because you're eventually going to be disappointed, right? So if you get in front of it and have the tools available to you to ensure you know what you need to do, and have the adults in your village understand your academic eligibility and your own, that can really kind of propel you into a positive mentality about school and your athletic abilities, and how your athletic abilities and academic success really go together, right? You can't really do one without the other. So we have enough time for one last fireside chat question, and I definitely want our listeners to know that we see your chats, and we're going to answer them shortly. So my last question is, a lot of our listeners work with both student athletes and non-athletes, and I just wanted to kind of highlight, young people obviously are developing, and they're changing, and there's a lot of growth happening. But student athletes are on a particular pathway. And so for student athletes, what might be, additional pressure points that they're working on that other students are not? So Jocelyn, why don't you take that one first?
Yeah, so there's probably a lot of them, but I would say that the biggest one that's salient to me right now is the fear or the actual experience of injury. So I think what we know about adolescent development is that in general, adolescents don't have full development of the parts of their brain that help them make rational decisions, and so are riskier in general. But we know that athletes are at great risk for injury. And so they're also, as they're getting, stronger physically and, trying new movements, not always paying attention to the difference between something being sore and then something being an actual injury. So I think that desire to keep pushing through maybe, and then actually having an injury or having an acute injury, and then dealing with the rehab and the implications of that are probably really, really impactful for high school students, and not something that the typical student population is thinking about. And injuries that are career ending, teenagers might think all injuries need to be, or all injuries are career ending, because those are the ones that maybe get publicized. But there's all of these, smaller ones that can happen that can be treated appropriately, but they may not have understand the nuance in that. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind with student athletes as compared to the general population. What an injury means to your identity as an athlete, it's huge.
That's a great point. I remember a lot of students I've worked with who had injuries junior year of high school, and they were like, it's over, my life's over, I'm never going to get a spot, no one's going to want me. And these were pretty bad, blow out your knee, these pretty bad surgery requiring injuries. But in the end, they got back to it. They got the spots they wanted. They really did. And it doesn't always work out, but I always tell the kids, like, you don't know yet. Don't lose hope. Like, just work at it, and you just never know what can happen if you keep at it. Stephanie, do you want to identify any other pressure points that, we haven't chatted about?
Yeah. I think that's a huge one. And part of what it ties into would be just in general, the massive amount of comparison. When I was growing up, like, we just didn't have all these mirrors in life coming back our way all the time. That's social media. That's, the tweet of the lineup that goes out for the high school team. And so everyone's friends see, okay, I'm not, in the lineup to start out with. I mean, that stuff just didn't exist for those of us who are really probably in these leadership positions. So it's just been interesting to be back in a different space, more on the youth end now, and to see, wow, these hierarchies and comparison moments are happening minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day for these young athletes to say, oh, well, I'm either, up here high enough to do this with sport, or I'm not. And so I think that helps us have greater empathy for, like, all right, there's just a lot more emotion around every aspect of this. What position am I playing as a freshman in high school? Is that going to get me where I want to go? Were not such benchmarks for those of us who are a little bit older, but because of that social media, because of the coverage, because of the infrastructure of recruiting and all of those things, there is a sense that you're behind all the time. It's not true for those of us who are, have been in the college space, because I can sit there and say, I look at all these other things that have sometimes nothing to do with that. And we're all looking for that story of someone who can overcome barriers as well. That doesn't show up in how you swing a racket. So there's so much more. But when you're an adolescent and your viewpoint is very, centric on yourself to begin with, that's incredibly hard to balance out. And so then as a parent, you're in the mix of that, as a coach, as a supporter, as someone in the camp. It gives me such great empathy for the level of internal strength it takes to control some of the messaging you believe about yourself and where you stand with peers and in the grand scheme of things. So we all know, if you've been on the college end, there's so many journeys and pathways to get where you want to go. And sometimes the pathway completely changes. I was playing one sport in my mind in college. I'm a college coach in a completely different sport. No one would have guessed that in my life, including myself. But there's so much that can happen. We just don't hear as much of that story. We constantly see the offers and tweeting and I'm committing here. And there's just so much more to all of that.
Yeah, that's so true. There's a lot of different pathways. I've seen kids switch from soccer to football and then go play football in college, or basketball to track. And there's just a lot of movement because kids are young, right?
Yeah.
Like, they're resilient. They can change. They can learn skills quickly.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. This has been so interesting to hear about and hear your experiences. We do have a few questions that I'd love to answer before we wrap up. So I will kind of read out the question, and then one of the three of us will answer. The first question we've got is, are there any individualized learning platforms you'd recommend to support student athletes? So there are many great individualized learning platforms. We partner with Fusion Academy, and they specialize in supporting students in a one-to-one learning environment. It's really great because it jumpstarts their learning, love for learning, and their personal confidence from this one-to-one. And they also have online learning, and they also have brick and mortar schools. And they tend to work with students who need flexible schedules or who need additional mental health support in their learning. Next question: what can high school athletic directors, as well as club directors, do more to help their athletes get recognized and pursue their sport in college? So I'll just say that, like, in my experience advising thousands of kids, it's all about giving them tools and the knowledge on how to get it themselves. And so Honest Game does provide training modules and webinars for student athletes and their families and coaches to understand the process step by step, but also give them the tools to do it themselves. So Stephanie, former college D1 coach, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think opportunities, unfortunately, media is a big thing, people focus on. So just the exposure to be able to be in that space, whatever that looks like for your school, that's always helpful. It's visual. But I think one of the keys that I would always come back to is people forget your academics open the most doors for this. So we spend all this time jetting around to practices and doing all these things. But if that can continue to be messaged that, hey, I mean, there's so many sports you can package aid. That was huge for me as a coach. I wasn't head count, full or no. I could do percentages of aid. So if someone had academics, that was a huge, huge benefit to be able to recruit and make a stronger team. So, that can really help, and it can close doors very quickly, as you guys talk about. But that's something that I think a lot of people forget, and you can get a lot of aid at Division III schools academically that you may not get athletically at a Division I school. So some of those perspectives are really key in how you strategize the journey.
Yeah, I think like for coaches, the best thing you can do is educate your families on the steps and what's worth doing and what isn't, and how to use their time wisely, because it is intimidating and it can be really stressful for families, because it's an unknown, right? It's just like you don't know what's happening, and you see other people doing it, so you feel this pressure, and there's pressure on the coaches and the counselors to know what to do as well, and they don't always know. Things change constantly. Like if you were a college athlete, I was a college athlete, recruiting is completely different now than it was when I was a kid, so there, like Stephanie said, there's Twitter, there's Instagram, there's online recruiting forums, there's email, there's ID camps, there's travel, there's showcases. There's so many different ways to get seen, and kids can do it on their own, and the coaches want to hear from them, really, right? So we had a really interesting question. I had a question regarding the relationship of the mental aspect of the athlete and how they respond to dealing with injury. Dr. Laura Mealy, author of Psyche of the Injured Athlete, relates this directly to their soul identity, as you said. Can you speak a bit on how you effectively deal with this, either as a one-on-one basis or team-wide, and the need for following rehab needing to outperform? Jocelyn, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually just had recently done a workshop on this, working with college athletes that are seniors and preparing to transition out of college sports, sports in a formal context. And one of the things that is unique about athletic identity as compared to other identities that people have is that it emerges pretty early. So people are identified as being talented in sports pretty early, and it's a very public identity. So when failure or disappointment or discouragement or injury occurs, everyone knows it. And so one of the things that we all need to think about is how we can make sure to communicate that we value the whole of a student athlete, even though even just saying the word student athlete makes it seem like it's those two things, and they're not 50-50, and there's other things that are important. So as coaches or other people who relate to kids in the sports context, making sure to ask them about music or their culture or what other kinds of things are important and motivating to them, and just remind them that you see them as more than an athlete. And then, like I mentioned with parents, especially really communicating that they are loved, not because of how they perform or how they make their parents feel when they are sitting in the stands doing a great job, but they're loved because of like who they are, no matter what they're doing. And reinforcing that messaging, I think, is really important. Obviously challenging, but worth doing.
So last two questions we have. I I've had multiple issues that stem from athletes feeling like their coaches don't like them. Is this something you've noticed? How do you recommend coaches address? Stephanie.
Ooh, this is a hard one. This is a hard one. There's a lot to unpack on this one. So we have this really tough tension, with sport where there's an impersonal nature to it and there's a personal nature to it, right? And that's life too. We cope with that in work. We grow in that skill set of how to manage those feelings toward an employer, things like that. People we care about in our lives too, relationships. So it is very difficult. It is something that I think is more common now that coaches have expressed, how do we navigate this? There's not an easy answer to this. However, I think it comes back to the culture of what we create of empowering solutions and the idea of, okay, let's unpack this a little bit more. What is something in your locus of control? What is something that you can take ownership of? That is, I can't change officials. I can't change a coach. We can't change people or other people's behavior or other people's ideologies. Or we're learning all these things in our life, right? It's frustrating. It's hard. But what can I do that doesn't leave me feeling powerless? I'm empowered to take some ownership over something. Maybe that's having a positive attitude despite this being frustrating and bringing effort despite feeling there's a personal, I'm not playing because my coach doesn't like me. Okay, well, let's work hard and let's control the things we do. And you know what? Maybe that means your teammates have respect for you because you work hard. There's a way to shift that lens to, we may not be able to address and change that very issue. And it may be truth, it may not be, that's potentially in the eye of the beholder, but we can work on what we have the ability to contribute to something. And that's what we have to do, in life beyond. So it's a very hard thing to learn, but it is one of those beautiful things that come out of the experience of playing sports that we wouldn't want. We wouldn't, want that, but we can look back in time and realize that's beneficial, in strengthening.
Yeah, and I think coaches also have different styles, right? Like some coaches lead with negative, some coaches lead with positive. So if you have students who think you don't like them, it may just be some negativity, right? So it could be just a matter of ensuring each student feels a positive note from you every day.
Well, and I would say this, Joyce, sorry. One of the best things I learned as a coach is from a coach. Hey, this is how I wouldn't want to make someone feel. Because I've just been fortunate to have so many great experiences I didn't even realize. And over here, this isn't jiving with me and it's telling me something about my style and what's important to me and what I'm seeing play out here.
Yeah, Jocelyn, last question for you and then we'll wrap up. Parents today seem to be the hardest on their student athlete. I've had many students tell me they wish their parents would not come to their games, that the parents make them feel less than what the parents feel their students should be doing. How can, ADs or coaches work on that with their families or their students?
Yeah, I love that question. It's another one with a ton to unpack. I think it refers back to some of the things that I mentioned at the beginning, with parents sort of understanding their role and their perspective. But I think organizations can help set some norms around parent involvement and maybe even do some sort of, like team meetings or check-ins and encourage. So one of my favorite things is to have parents ask their children like what their rating of themselves as like a spectator, would be, or like, what kinds of things are helpful for you, as the athlete. From me, I got told, one of my kids, like, don't cheer that. Like every time you say that, it doesn't make any sense. And it just confuses me. Like, I'm like, okay, what can I say? Right? Like, okay, I'm not gonna say this thing. So get that feedback, because as much, I think every parent is well-intentioned and wants the best. But when we're providing support, we have to make sure that we're providing like the right kind of support at the right time. So timing is really key. You don't want, there's whole research studies done on like the car ride home from the game. Like that's not the best time to have the conversation. So you can say, what's best for us about like checking in if you do think that there is something that needs to be checked in, or like, do you want me to like text you this, whatever? Do you want me to like look at the video? Like ask the athlete. And so make sure that it's really in their under their like control, and they're getting empowered to get the feedback in the best possible way. And maybe even like giving yourself like a rule of like, I'm not going to say anything during the whole game. I'm not going to, cheer it on. I'm just going to watch. If you can do that, that's like super impressive, sports parent spectating. But we don't want to take that fun out of that experience for our kids. That's really, really sad. And I think if parents knew that their kids felt that way, they would be motivated to make those changes, because no one wants that.
I totally agree. And I think that what you said really resonates, like the listen, right? Coaches, ADs, counselors, listen to your kids, parents, listen to the kids, because deep down they can express it if you give them the time, right? If you give them the opportunity. I mean, even as a coach, I remember I had students express to me, I don't respond well to negativity, or that won't work for me, and their ability to express themselves was so key. But it was key for me to listen to them and then respond, right? Like, oh, I don't want to be coached constantly. Give me a break. Like all these things that kids have the ability at the high school level to express. We all need to listen, and while it may not always work with your coaching style, you can't always do what they want. It's also important to hear them, and that will be, a very easy way to support. So Stephanie and Jocelyn, we're going to wrap it up, but is there anything we didn't talk about that you kind of wanted to throw in there and make sure our team hears that they can take away?
Just thank you to this whole community for coming out for the conversation. I think the fact that it's a priority is just a really encouraging thing from my space. And even though we can't meet everyone's needs all the time, just the effort to grow and learn is just so key for all of us. So thank you to everybody who was here.
Yeah, agreed. This is an incredible opportunity and space, and I'm glad, so many people are around. So thanks for the opportunity, and we'll continue to be in touch. And I guess I would say spread the word with people who who also need some of this messaging as well.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Jocelyn and Stephanie, for joining us. Have a great day.